All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to have everyone here. I'm Karen Wolf. I'm the director of the John Carter Brown Library, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to this informal JCB Reads event where we feature authors who have been researchers at the JCB. It's a special pleasure to welcome Surekha Davies, um, who has been a fellow has many wonderful accomplishments. I'm going to tell you about some of them, but most importantly was a short-term fellow at the JCB in 2013-14, and then returned as a long-term fellow at the JCB in 2018-19. So Dr. Davis was educated at the University of Cambridge, and then also at the Warburg Institute at the University of London, which is where she earned her PhD. She worked as a curator at the British Library during her doctoral research, and taught at Western Connecticut State University. I also love how she describes this on her website, which is a marvelous compendium of some of her work and thoughts. In December of 22, she transcended the academy in order to work full-time as a writer. And really exciting to be able to talk to her today about this marvelous volume, Humans, A Monstrous History. Just totally exciting and different. It's a really different book. And I know you're going to enjoy the conversation. I know I will as well. So the first thing I think we're going to do, Surekha, is to let you actually share your screen and tell us a bit about this book before you and I have some conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I have a little 10-minute spiel to warm everyone up, and then I look forward to all of your questions. Okay, so thank you again for having me. So for most people, monsters are primarily the stuff of fiction and trivia, relegated to the spooky corners of their bookcases. But in Humans, A Monstrous History, I showed that everywhere there are categories, there are also implicitly monsters or category breakers. The book is a multi-millennial history of how humans have created monsters out of one another, and what these monsters tell us about the origins of the modern world, as well as humanity's present and future. Today, monsters saturate culture in books and movies, in the news, in social media feeds. Beings that get framed as monsters include ancient gods and futuristic cyborgs, Dracula and E.T., immigrants, and so-called crazy cat ladies. But what is it that defines a monster, and in whose eyes? What are the consequences of framing people or other beings as monsters, of monsterification? Monster-making processes determine where humanity supposedly ends. Societies invent monsters to mark out 3 types of boundaries. And the first is between the human and the non-human, between us and ecology, or animals, gods, machines, extraterrestrials. The second kind of set of boundaries are those between social groups. Monster-making processes define and police race, gender, and religious and ethnic groups. And societies use these practices to attempt to justify unequal amounts of rights, resources, and protections across groups. The third type of monster making invents the parameters of normal for a human body or behavior. And we might think about words like freak, giant, or prodigy. So what I mean when I say monster is that it's a broad catch-all for a whole bunch of positive, negative, or neutral terms that people use to define something that doesn't fit their categories of typical beings in the world. And it's not just something that happens in fiction, but also in science, in everyday life, and in the public sphere. And so all monster means is a category breaker. And to that, I would add, there are no monsters, and all of them are real. And by no monsters, I mean it's a label defined by observers. It's not inherent in any body or thing. And secondly, what do I mean by these monsters nonetheless being real? When someone defines a person or a group as monstrous, as breaking the category of the human or of the body politic, there are consequences in law, in customs, and in people's lives. So in terms of the scope of this book, I look at what I call monster making, about the stories people tell about who is or isn't normal or typical, and the processes of defining groups as supposedly transcending categories, or transgressing them even. And so it is these systems of classification that bring objects like monsters into being. And what monsters reveal then is something about the people doing the naming, not the people or communities they name. And so what I'm doing in this book is shining a light on the monster makers. And in so doing, I hope I've offered an alternative history of humanity in which, the monster is a lens to reveal hidden assumptions that have shaped ideas about nature, technology, people, and society for millennia. And the chapters are thematic. I, trace the types of boundaries I mentioned, between the human and then categories like animal or machine, between categories for social groups. There are chapters on race, nation, and gender, and the kind of definitions of the parameters of the human body. And so the book will take readers from Earth to outer space. And a couple of conclusions or kind of arguments I make include, the kind of observation that today's urgent questions about human rights, labor, wealth, health, technology, and climate justice rest on a foundation of monsters. And by that, I mean stories people tell about who counts as fully human, what counts as normal, and who gets cast as the monsters of the body politic. Everywhere from gymnastics to policing, monster making has shaped how we think about science, society, and humanity. We can't fully understand the present or avoid making the same mistakes in the future without attending to the long history of monsters. So for the next 4 minutes or so, I'm going to offer like two little teasers, a glimpse into some of the stories in the book. And let me start here. She peers out, a folded sheet in her hands, almost as if she's waiting to show us her homework. The vibrant pattern on her dress makes it look like a party frock, a celebration of orange and crimson stripes, swirls, tendrils, and tulips that echo the blooms in her hair. Slashed sleeves show off a rich green fabric underneath her dress, picking up the leaves that garland her head. Antoinette Gonsalves, or Antonietta Gonzalez, born in Paris in the 1580s, was perhaps 8 years old when this watercolor was copied from a recent painting. Someone, not knowing how old Antoinette was, penned the caption, "A 20-year-old woman with a furry head resembling that of an ape and a smooth, hairless body." Antoinette's portrait appears in the massive repository of drawings and watercolors amassed by the 16th century Bolognese physician, collector, and naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi. Scroll through the digitized volumes of drawings, and it's difficult not to do a double take at this portrait of little Antoinette, for her face looks decidedly furry. And this picture is in a volume largely devoted to animals. In my next teaser, I'd like to take you to the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine in London. Here I consulted a huge pile of binders of ephemera, pamphlets, newspaper cuttings, postcards, photographs, and handbills. Each of the 5 binders is encased in a stiff-sided archival box. On a sticker on the spine of each box, the cataloguer summarized the contents with a single, pithy, disturbing word: freaks. These binders, full of people framed as monsters, reveal dehumanizing classificatory systems at work. As pamphlet after pamphlet and cutting after cutting reveal, these individuals were category breakers in the eyes of many who saw them. Sometimes these people leveraged their distinctiveness into a life in show business after a fashion. They let people gaze for a fee at their unusual anatomies, or endured it under duress. Some advertisements crush together a bewildering range of human performers come prisoners. Mr. Smith's exhibition, a bargain at just 1 penny, boasted the Norfolk giant, Tom Thumb, the celebrated dwarf, a two-headed child, and the African lady in her native costume. I'll continue to quote, this beautiful creature, in addition to possessing exquisite beauty and elegance of form and feature, speaks all the ancient and modern languages with the greatest ease and facility. End quote. In Mr. Smith's curatorial telling, the edge of humanity was a place of both atypical births and prodigious excellence. At the height of European imperial dominance in the 19th and early 20th centuries, peoples from Tierra del Fuego, sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, and similarly distant corners of Europe's empires were transported to such cities as London and Paris and forced to perform their lives on public display at exhibitions and fairs. The language of their exhibitors made clear that they viewed these people as the lowest rung of humanity, as almost bestial, incapable of receiving God's grace. And I shall end there and let you kind of read the book for more.
Marvelous. Thank you. That was great. That was super helpful. I mean, having gone through the book myself, I love the pieces that you chose to highlight, and you won't be surprised that some of my follow-up questions are going to focus on exactly these questions, particularly some of the examples, but also some of the categories that you help us to think through. So, Surekha, I wanted to start just by asking you if you could tell us a little more about the origins of this project. Every book has a starting moment. So, what was yours?
Well, there are a couple of kind of background starts, I suppose, watching too much Star Trek. My earliest memories being watching The Muppet Show and basically being cross that the world wasn't actually like that. But it was as I was finishing my first book on fellowship at the Library of Congress that I realized that there needed to be a book that, stretched from science to the humanities, from ancient history to the present, and really pointed out that in the categories of analysis and the categories of, political humanity, they don't exist out there in nature like the universal gravitational constant, but they get brought into being. And I was at an astrobiology conference in the Library of Congress because it was just happening downstairs. And this is a conference of scientists and ethicists talking about how, people might prepare for the possibility of learning that there was life, that extraterrestrial life existed and was maybe even on Earth. And there were panels about, weapons and what would you do if, hostile aliens landed, or, they brought dangerous pathogens, and all the scientists could think about was like weapons.
Mm,
And I thought, well, preparing for discovery also means preparing to work for humanity to work together on a planetary scale. If we can't deal with the alienness of one another, and just, have wars, then are we really going to be able to prepare for a kind of big scientific calamity or change? And, the scientists thought that was like the wrong question. And I realized, well, no, actually, this question is the point. And there's something in, the deep humanities that can speak to issues of science and public policy that that no one is thinking about. And that is, how we, categorize beings in the world and make decisions, based on that.
mm, mm. That's fascinating. Often when you ask people about the origins of their books, they'll say, "Well, I came across a manuscript or something." But I can honestly say this is the first time I've heard a historian talk about an astrobiology conference as the origin. It's a great story, but also I think indicative of your kind of capacious approach to this subject and a kind of really creative kind of way in. Um, I wondered about um, what kind of what you wanted to provoke with this book. Like you've made a conscious choice to write in a kind of public way, like both in a public forum, but also in a public style. Like as a scholar, I can read that there is a scholarship that you're contributing to here along in multiple disciplines, actually. And I want to ask you about that too. Like, where do you want scholars to come back to this book and say, "Oh, we should actually be thinking about this differently now because of because of this research?" But also to public conversations. Like, what are the ways that you wanted to change people's way of thinking or add to their kind of body of knowledge?
With the scholarly side of things, I would really like to see the Academy take monsters seriously. I mean, really seriously. If you're talking about categories, there are monsters there. This is not
Mm,
something frivolous. This is not something marginal. You know, you know, disciplines may not be talking about them, but that doesn't mean they aren't there. And they are something that kind of links, like fundamental questions in, say, kind of history to questions in literary studies, around words to questions in the history of science, to issues of science. And so I would like to see, monster history as seen as a kind of lens that has, the kind of explanatory power of something like economics or gender or race or culture or politics or science, because in fact
mm,
categories undergird all of them. So, it's not like I'm type A or anything, like desires for, where this book might go decades from now. And in the kind of public conversation, I would love for this book to both be a kind of exciting and fun read. There's, pop culture in here, there's strange, fun stuff, but also a compelling explanation of things that, the kind of curious person runs into in their life, everywhere from, politics to science, and kind of sees how, the foundations of a lot of today's ways of thinking and indeed monstrifying people is very, very old. And so what that means in practical terms is if you think about, someone like Antonietta Gonzalez, or the kind of people who are, performing or forced to perform at fairs. I mean, these were real people to which horrible stuff happened, and
mm,
these were people who often lost bodily autonomy and privacy. Antoinette, like various other, um, you know, children and women who were thought to be unusually hairy would be examined to see how far the hairiness went, for example. And so I'd like it if people thought about the kind of humanity of the people who don't get the kind of access to the same rights as they do. Secondly, I would hope that people kind of notice the um, stories behind the stories. I have examples of, for example, this preacher John Knox, who was really angry that Queen Mary the First on the throne of England was a Catholic. But he wrote
mm,
an angry pamphlet about how having a woman on the throne who was ruling was monstrous. And he uses that word over and over again to say women shouldn't be leaders. So what he really wants is for there to not be a Catholic on the throne, but he goes for the like misogyny angle because that's what he thinks is going to be most likely to get people on his side. So I hope people think about the agendas of individuals and groups doing the monstrifying. And also, I hope, people kind of realize that, the monster makers, their appetite is insatiable. They'll start at one place and like more and more groups will be monstrified. And so,
mm,
don't let them start. Stand up for people who are more vulnerable than you are, because, the kind of history of humanity kind of shows how contagious that is, both in terms of being something that becomes normalized in the society, but also that it's, this is a beast whose greed cannot be, stemmed. And so
Mm.
there are fun things in the book, honest, like cartoons and Muppets. But I hope people will come for the monsters and stay for the ethics, and that there will be enough, fun and amazing stuff that will
Mm.
nourish them as they think about the more serious consequences of monster making.
Mm. Let me ask you just a follow-up about that. What you've just kind of described for us in a sense as a distinction between monstrifying, that is, describing other humans as monstrous, whether it's Knox's monstrous regiment of women, or or whether it is imagining something monstrous in a non-human way. It's fantastical things, whether it's Muppets or it's Star Trek's extraterrestrial non-human. um, is there an important distinction in the way you think about monstrifying between describing other humans as monstrous as opposed to the non-human monstrous? What's the relationship between those two things? Is there one? Is there a kind of cultural psychology around that is deeply related, or is there a distinction, really? And is there an ethical distinction too?
Hmm. Um, oh, I had not really thought of it that way. It seems as if, I mean, to me, there are these, in a way, like where are all the places where they have categories? What are the categories out there, right?
Mm.
And then none of those categories are, defined in isolation. It's always in relation to other
Mm.
things. And so if human is a category, then how is where is its boundaries in relation to um,
Muppets.
the ecology for well, we'll get to the Muppets, to the ecology. And I guess here, if you think of the human as a discrete um, individual life form, whose pronoun is I, you know
Mm.
then what of our microbiome and all
Mm.
the kind of gut microbes that shape our personalities and moods? What about the fact that our skin is porous? So,
Mm.
so that is a kind of different kind of monster thinking, if you will,
Mm.
because it's I mean the notion of the human as an individual life form turns out to not be true. And we are monsters, and equally in an evolutionary sense. I mean, each of our kind of like innovations, I call them that, those kind of mutations, and that's a word Darwin used, we are a
Mm.
composite of mutations. I mean, we are the ultimate Frankenstein's monster in
Mm.
terms of little kind of inherited characteristics from kind of different lineages that helped, the people who didn't die out to not die out, or other
Mm.
the random, selection of genes. Um, and so if you were to look at say, the kind of human machine boundary, again, like why is there
Mm.
a human machine boundary? Well, if you have humans over here and machines over there, but you start, replacing parts, then what
Mhm.
happens? And this is
Mm.
where, of course, this is really plays out much more in fiction than in real life.
Mm.
Although, every so often there's a story about, the first successful heart transplant from a pig. And,
Mhm.
it is a little bit uncanny. And those are the sorts of things that, ethicists think about. In terms of the kind of human boundaries, um, they are, I mean, for a start, and yeah, I mean, I don't think everyone on Earth would agree with me here, and for this, I am deeply sorry. But if human is a category with all of us in it, then the
Mhm.
kinds of divisions drawn within them are divisions from within a kind.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
are human, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so these are divisions within the body politic, and so those
Mhm.
are really they have, constant consequences for the unfolding of human lives and the writing of laws.
Mhm.
For example, the
Mhm.
the black codes in the Americas in the 17th century brought the category of, the Black African, enslaved person into being as kind of chattel property with no end to that kind of enslaved situation, and something that also
Hmm.
got passed down to the children. So there is kind of a difference between those human divisions and, say, kind of human extraterrestrial divisions. I
Hmm.
mean, many of those are
Hmm.
more to do with science and more to do with science fiction, and
Hmm.
because of course the microbiome and evolution. I mean, those are kind of scientific boundary drawing. But the human ones, that's where the society is. And I guess this book brings together science, society, and pop culture. And
Hmm.
those boundaries, some are more boundaries sketched out in one or other of those.
Hmm. So interesting. Thank you. I wanted to ask you one other question about along these same lines, which is about um, of course, I'm an early modernist, so I want to think about like what's the particularity of the early modern history here, which seems like a lot to me. Like this seems like a deeply early modern, and of course, you are an early modernist, so it seems like a deeply early modern book, Antoinette. But also, of course, I was thinking about the kinds of creations of other people and creatures in early modern images when Europeans are coming to the Americas and they're creating all kinds of um, fantastical creatures in the ocean. They are monstrifying, to use your word, indigenous people. Um, so it feels to me like a very early modern book. Does it feel that way to you too? Do you feel like there is a distinctly early modern contribution to the process of monstrification? We can use that word.
Absolutely. It is very much a process which reshaped the world as we know it through a couple of things, one of which is deeply cartographic. So I have, let me have a slide or two here to make this easier to see. And the thing about the kind of 16th century end of the early modern is there's also like a classical antiquity part
Mm.
to that. So there's the backstory, followed by kind of the early modern. So I have some shiny things. Won't come in the right order because when do they ever? Um, so what did the early modern period inherit? These kind of ideas from classical antiquity about how places that were distant geographically and where the climate was harsh,
Mm.
minds and bodies would be denatured. So you would have, like the person with the kind of head in their face in their chest because they had no head and so on. And we don't have, say, kind of maps from the ancient world that survive that show this, but there are, medieval maps that have the kind of zones of the world laid out when the Mediterranean is kind of nice and temperate, and then you go out into kind of extremes of climate where supposedly, bodies and minds would be transformed. And this one is kind of cool because it's got the kind of classical and the Christian stuff together with, Jerusalem in the center, paradise in the east at the top. There's the wall behind which the tribes of Gog and Magog were imprisoned by Alexander the Great. And in the south, which is on the right of your screen, since south isn't the east here, there are kind of monstrous peoples that supposedly lived on the edge of the world. So this is the kind of medieval kind of inheritance, go far enough and have monstrous peoples. But, but human bodies were thought to be malleable. They had
Mm.
four humors in them. And depending on what you ate and depending on the climate and even what you did, those humors could go kind of in and out of balance. So you have this paradigm within which the body is not fixed anyway. And you have this theory of distant places where, the climate deforms people. And so once you're mapping all of that on a grid with latitude and longitude, once, Ptolemy's coordinate system was recovered in the West, where it had been not terribly well remembered through the Middle Ages. Once you have latitude and longitude, you can actually see, look at the kind of images of people on a map like this from the 16th century. And there you have the kind of monstrous peoples at the kind of far north. Suddenly you can see how climate, geography, and latitude kind of come together, and you can kind of map who lives where and do a kind of visual comparative ethnology. But the thing is, once you're kind of traveling everywhere, that does beg the question, where's the boundary between human space and monster space? And so the kind of the theoretical, place where bodies were denatured was suddenly, potentially also the places where European colonists were going. And so you needed news stories about, that weren't gonna, so you could actually go and settle, and there was going to be a limit to how much a white person's body changed. But of course, new story to kind of deal with the new situation. Black Africans were supposedly much more better suited to work in, the climates of the Caribbean than white people. So you have these huge, shifts to some of the stories told about who is the default person. And of course, with indigenous peoples who had seemingly not heard of, the word of the true God, then there was another set of questions to ask. Was this because their minds weren't, refined enough, or had they forgotten once what they'd been told? So these questions of, are these people different because they're not entirely human, become, questions that, people with different agendas, are kind of answering in different ways.
Mm. Thank you so much. It's so just super interesting to think about the way that difference and the predication of difference is articulated in texts. I mean, we're all like super familiar with kind of European exploration texts versus images, whether it's cartographic or other kinds of imagery, and how assertive that is. This will be different. This will be different space, and you can see what kinds of different creatures there are, and the people will be different, and they will be different in these ways. Just very super interesting. And so I wondered about. I was just leafing through the book again. I've got lots of questions here. I wondered if you could talk a bit about, again, another early modern context question about you have two chapters on race and nation, and you pull these concepts apart to then push them back together in a sense. Could you talk about that?
Big question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know. We have
No,
just like 2 minutes to talk about it. No, I know. These are big questions. Obviously, this is definitely a kind of a
yeah.
taster. Everyone should read the book and spend time with it for sure.
Yeah, okay. So I have these two chapters that are called race hyphen nation. So yeah, I'm kind of they're very uncanny. I define them, and then I say they're the same, and then I say, well, actually, are they? Um, and I guess what I kind of realized was that both of these are kind of rhetorics that work in the same way. They are, they've kind of become words, I mean, today, supposedly, people can become citizens of a country in a variety of ways, and then they are a citizen, and they may have generations of children who are also citizens of that country. And so legal paperwork, confects this idea of a citizen as an administrative kind of category. But that's not how citizenship is actually experienced in real life, because there are cultural memories of what a citizen of a particular country is supposed to, quote unquote, look like and sound like. And those stories are ultimately about race.
Mm,
And that there are also stories that are, very old. And I mean, for example, in medieval England, in medieval Britain, they went back, they go back, 1,000 years, not long after the Norman conquest of southern Britain. There's this 11th century aristocratic chronicler, Gerald of Wales. He's half Welsh nobility, half descended from Norman conquerors, and he writes these kind of bad-tempered, rude things, about the English. I actually have a quote. He says, they're the most worthless of all people under heaven. He says they're the slaves of the Normans. And, it's only the English who do the jobs of plowman, shepherd, cobbler, skinner, cleaner of the sewers. So he's kind of racializing the English as inferior, because they are, essential workers, if you will. They're laboring with these nasty substances.
mm,
And, today people don't associate race with medieval Britain unless perhaps they're a medievalist. But you see the ways in which, Gerald of Wales essentialized and dehumanized the English. I mean, it's just the way people define and weaponize race today. Um, and those stories, shape laws and institutions and
mm,
customs. And so kind of one of the things I was trying to do with these chapters, for a general audience, was to show how these ideas they're used to thinking of separately are actually together much more of the time than they may even have imagined. Uh,
mm,
and also to show that this is you know, categories of race, where, these stories of differential rights being justifiable, passing down through lineages because of something that's passing down through the blood, goes back to, before the age of Atlantic slavery.
mm.
But it's,
It's
yeah, there's the 2 out of 10 chapters. They're kind of they're in the heart of the book, and it's also a way to show how, say the kind of Iberian colonial context was rather different from the American one by, drawing on things like, casta paintings, and
Mm. I think, I mean, not to like jump around. This is connected in my mind. I don't know if it will be legible as I articulate it, but one of the things that I appreciate is that you're really dealing with an incredibly capacious chronology here, in addition to like an enormously complex set of topics which you um, kind of analyze as monsters and monstrous and monstrosity and monstrification. Um, but I really appreciate how you help us see the kind of general patterns as well as the specificity. So one of the places where that strikes me as really effective is when you're talking about gender and complex issues of gender fluidity, both physiological and cultural, um, and disability as a kind of social construct, as an kind of assigned um, kind of category, as well as an experience. So I would contrast like the way that you talk about Antoinette, the beautiful young woman whose image you shared with us earlier, in that remarkable dress. And you talk about the runner, Castor Semenya, who, really suffered incredibly
Mm.
with Olympic authorities over gender identity and sex assignment and so on. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that question of general and specific, and how you feel about like moving so dramatically in time and space within some of these chapters to keep us grounded in the specificity, but also help us see the big picture. Like
Mhm.
how did you work that out?
This is, all about the kind of storytelling techniques of creative narrative nonfiction writing. I mean, this, was going outside of academic genres entirely. So one part of the answer is, you know, models and kind of subgenres that are good at telling human-centered stories. So apparently the general reader needs this, which for me is a long path to get to, because you know what my first book is about? It's about pieces of paper influencing other people's. There are on one level there
Very
are
good
people
pieces
in
of
my
paper, very compelling pieces of
it's
paper, just
pieces
want to
of
say.
paper.
But yeah.
I mean, there are no plots. There aren't people running around doing things. So I think the next book will be really plot driven. Um, but the kind of long form documentary, kind of magazine journalism type writing will often follow a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and drama and things happening to people. You know, there was a flood and she was trapped in the house. There was a puppy. Are they going to get out? But then, every so often you have a cliffhanger, and then the kind of the journalist will zoom out and to tell you, like, why is there a flood again? And it go in and out. So I was informed by that kind of writing. Also, I kind of realized fiction is an important model for figuring out how to write stories in which people care about what's kind of going on. And what I try to do is, I mean, often the chapters have lots of sections in them, and I try to kind of build in cliffhangers
Mhm.
so that
Mhm.
oh, great, did you notice some? So that people would want to keep reading. And it was very hard. I had, lots more material that could have gone in. So it's a tussle between, the length of the book, because you don't want it to be so alarming that people are frightened to get it off the shelves, even if they bought it. Um, but I had so kind of, you might say the overall structure of the book is kind of ontological, not chronological. We move from Earth
Mm.
to outer space, and in the middle we go through humans. And then within each chapter as well, there's a little bit of that kind of thematic move. With the animals chapter starts with that kind of human ape kind of set of conundrums. And
Mhm.
then we end up, and also we were further in the past, and then we end up at the microbiome. So there's sort of like a movement through time, but also things become weirder and weirder, I suppose. And I guess I tried to make sure there was a story regularly. And there was some stories were just amazing, and so they had to go in. But I think each chapter is its own weird little monster, and I had to deal with it on its own terms, with my own, limitations of time and interest. Um, but there's a real kind of sense of more of feel. I mean, I knew what the general things were I wanted to get in, but what's going to be big, what's going to be little. Ed Yong's An Immense World was a great
Mm.
book for this, because it's the whole animal kingdom.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet, as I go through it, chapter by chapter, I'm not pissed off about the animals that aren't in it. I'm too busy being enthralled
Yeah.
by what's there. And that really was one of those kind of penny dropping moments for me. That if you can get the segues right, it's as if, each example, whatever shape it is, it's going to put out its flipper, and then the next creature on the next example is going to put out a tentacle, and they're just going to line up nicely like a beautiful relay, um, in theory. So as someone said to me, like the first tradeless book is an odd beast. You're still learning how to do the things, and she called it the weird first pancake. So perhaps it's the weird first pancake.
That
Um,
person was monstrifying your book. I don't know that
well,
I
there
would
is
accept
that.
that. All right. We've got some wonderful questions. I also just want to make a point about what a great cover it is. It's so fantastic. I don't know, you must have had a fantastic experience working with a cover designer, but to do this kind of mirror finish
Yeah.
there, it's so great. And the fantastic detailing around the mirror is just, it's really wonderful. The cover designer had a good time, I think,
Yeah, yeah.
is
The art
my
director
strong
was,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah,
she was
yeah,
great.
yeah. Really, really fun. Okay, so let me go to a couple of questions here, and then I'm going to preserve 5 minutes at the end here. Let's see. Peter asks, what about the factor of the fear of the unknown? Can you talk about how the unknown is monstrous? Versus, I guess, Peter, not to like piggyback on your question here, but um, versus sometimes you're talking about people monstrifying things they do know, like they know it and they're, in other words, or maybe actually that is fear of unknown. Anyway,
Mhm.
so that's a question for you.
Yeah. Fear is definitely a thing in the monster making where there's a negative charge being put on the supposed monster. And then the question is like, well, what is it that they're fearing? And I would say that, when I talk about the kind of monster categories, the practice of monster making, I'm not simply looking at, all the examples of people being dehumanized or the
Mm.
examples of people, being in conflict, but rather where people have, where beings are being identified as blurring things that are supposed to be separate. So the category of the mixed heritage individual in, say, the
Mm.
colonial Americas is messing up, the simple binary, say, in colonial British America uh, of an enslaved black person and a free white person. The South African comedian Trevor Noah was born
Mm.
illegal. I mean, he was hidden for the first 8 years of his life because
Mm.
you could not be a mixed race child in South Africa.
Mm.
And so why the big deal? It's because you can't keep sustain the story of separate unless you
Yeah.
decide the monsters are either invisible and they don't exist. Trans people now are facing
Yeah.
this, or making them hyper visible, and this is where
Yeah.
the Star of David, for
Hmm.
Jewish people,
Right.
so that
Labels.
you could
Yeah.
tell, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
um, and so there is an element of fear um, that drives that kind of monster making where the monster is being identified as a threat. And I hope it's on here, a brilliant slide that will segue us into like somewhere entirely different, but entirely about fear. And that's the notion of the uncanny.
Mm.
Are we wrong? Oh, are we sharing the right thing? No, we're not. Sorry.
Mm.
Let me share this thing. And so, this Japanese roboticist, I believe, did study of how people felt, how comfortable they felt. So that's the affinity scale as for different kinds of beings that were more or less like healthy people. And
Mm.
people felt kind of meh for an industrial robot. And I guess up here you might have like the toy robot, things that are cute. They become more like people. But then when something becomes really, really close to humanity, that feeling of comfort goes right down. Here's the uncanny valley. And so prosthetic hands are creepy. So this is all creepy. And then you start feeling good again as the human likeness goes up. So the fear is around the bottom of the valley is where beings are very, very like us, but clearly not us. And here, a corpse is the scariest. And this is, when beings are moving the dotted line. So it's even more terrifying. Hello, zombie, the most scary thing. Um, and I guess monster stories are, yeah, kind of explanations. Um, and a way of making an abstract fear something concrete. And then you can decide, what you're going to do about it. You're going to create new laws so that you can identify them and hope they don't, intermarry,
Mm,
and so on.
mm, hmm. Yeah. So on point here. That makes me want to skip here too. Adrian has a question about um, monstrifying being contagious, and in particular, how does a religious context play into this? Like the Spanish, English, Ottoman, or other contexts. What does religious hierarchy have to do with monstrifying? Um, you talk about witchcraft in the book, and obviously witchcraft is driven in Western Europe a lot by the religious context and by the Inquisition in particular. But I wonder if you want to think about that in comparative terms.
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, there's actually a lot of mileage in this kind of notion of contagion here. And
Mm,
one was I mean, certainly in early modern, Europe and its colonies, there were, I mean, sort of kind of concerns in kind of Iberian context that if you hadn't been Christian all the way up your lineage, something in you was not going to be fully Christian. You had
mm,
the notion of limpieza de sangre. So there's a contagion that passes down through the blood. So this is a way to legitimize continuing to treat, some people and their, descendants differently. But the problem with faith is that it's invisible. I mean,
mm,
sure, you might catch someone practicing something they shouldn't, but you don't really know what they think. If you don't get to
mm,
watch them doing something. And so this urge to find a mark on the body, and also the kind of great fear, in colonial Spanish America of people eating and drinking the wrong things in the wrong way is again because of what you can't apprehend through the senses, and that's the genuine faith, and so that also fear of even your good parishioners having their faith contaminated by others is there. And I guess one of the fears of that people have of the supposed monsters is that they will corrupt other people, right? Corrupt the young.
mm,
Um, but then there's also different kind of contagion, which is when once you start demonizing people, that somehow it's like the process itself takes on
mm,
a life of its own. And this was the case of the European witch hunts, whereby, people were accused, they were tortured. The only thing they could try and do to stop the torture was to just say all the things they were supposed to say. They'd be asked to name other people, and so then you have the kind of a different kind of contagion. So this is the revolution that eats its children.
mm. Yeah,
Uh, so
yeah,
I
yeah,
think more or less
yeah,
answer
yeah.
your
Thank you.
question.
I wanted, and I think we got to another question there too about the comparing about the Indies and the New World and these kinds of different contexts, different global contexts. I wanted to come back to two final questions. One is to ask you, which is a terrible question to ask someone when they've just finished a book, but I am confident that given how many different things you're thinking about and interested in, I'm sure you've got an idea for something you're already working on. That's A. And then the next is, what have you been reading lately?
Mm. I do have an idea for what I'm going to do next, and it will be more creepy and uncanny stuff. Just not humans. And I might kind of move to make it, you know, more of the uncanny and creepy, and maybe less of the politics, but we'll see how that goes. But kind of really to stay with the, captivating strangeness and maybe go further into that. And what have I been reading? So I'm kind of halfway through Hallie Rubenhold's book, The Five, which is about the five earliest known victims of Jack the Ripper. And the writing is absolutely incredible. We just have very little in terms of documentary evidence about the lives of any of these five women. But Rubenhold is this master storyteller who, for kind of every bit of, documentation or every newspaper report, she'll then, tells you all about the what it was like to live in Victorian London. There's documentation, say, about each of these women's circle, the other members of their family. She traces, the kind of evidence for like a whole bunch of people in each circle. And what strikes me now, I'm reading the fourth woman out of five, is how many of the structures around their lives were just dreadful. So they were
Mm,
all poor, and they all started out just being regular, hardworking people trying to live their lives. Uh, Once they died, everybody assumed they were prostitutes. And so
mm,
the first thing's like, oh, well, this must be why. So that was kind of striking, the kind of storytelling, which made it okay almost, or unsurprising that they were murdered. Um, but there were some of the problems they were surrounded with. Alcohol was in everything. Cough mixture, stuff for your child when they were sick. Like it was in, so the risk of one of at least one of these two of these women did become alcoholics. How could you avoid it? There was alcohol in everything. Um, Women got paid so incredibly badly. Some of their marriages fell apart. Divorce was unaffordable if you were poor. But the woman could go and turn up at the workhouse, and the way you had to demonstrate how awful your life was to even be able to sleep indoors. Um, they were at risk if they were out without a man. So, they would try and find some kind of some kind of friend or an arrangement with a man, because otherwise they were just going to be in a worse plight. And, as I've been reading it, I just thought, isn't this what it's like to be poor in the US now? The
mm, mm.
structures that
Yeah,
prevent you,
so precarious,
it's
so
so you
precarious and
cannot.
monstrifying,
And
in fact.
monstrifying.
Yeah,
So it's been
yeah.
very
I
strange
wondered about that.
to join London that way.
Yeah, no, I thank you for mentioning that because I had read quite a lot about that book when it came out and I don't know why I didn't read the book. I read about it, but I'm gonna go get it. This is my favorite question to ask because I love reading what other people are reading. Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It was a ton of fun, and I really enjoyed the book, and
Thank
just
you.
love thinking about JCB Fellows and their fantastic work. So thank you.
Well, thank you
Thanks,
for
everyone.
thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, bye bye.